Jim, I'm glad you brought up the budget deficit and taxes because that's what I want to address next. That is one of the biggest issues we face as a state, is addressing our deficit. So I'm going to talk about why we're in this mess and how taxes are both part of the problem and part of the solution. First of all, there is some dispute about how large the budget deficit was. Some people say it was $5 billion, some people say it was $8 billion. Either way, it's a lot of money. Clearly, there was a problem that had to be addressed. Why did we have such a large budget deficit? There are several reasons. One reason is because there were federal funds previously available from the stimulus that were no longer available. Another reason is that there were some accounting changes, adverse accounting changes that had been put off and that finally went into effect. Another reason, of course, was lingering effects from the recession of 2008 and 2009. But I believe that one of the biggest contributors to the budget deficit was the significant reductions in state and local taxes that had occurred as a result of previous tax reform, loosely called. Prior to 2011, when my opponent took office, the state of Ohio had repealed most corporate franchise taxes on businesses. The state had reduced state income taxes by 21%. The state repealed tangible personal property taxes, as I mentioned, which really caused a revenue hit to schools. And then they replaced it with a different business tax that doesn't raise nearly as much revenue. So tax cuts from prior years were the biggest contributing factor to our budget deficit. They're part of the problem. Now, my opponent has previously said that because they had this large budget deficit, they had to choose between making drastic cuts to the local government fund, which I'll talk about in a bit, or raising taxes by 50%. His belief is that, of course, you make the cuts because you can't ever raise taxes. I disagree. Why? Because sound fiscal policy and history teach us that sometimes the right thing to do is to raise taxes, particularly if you just cut them dramatically and if you're in bad economic times. Let me start with a 2003 bipartisan report that was issued by a committee of state legislators and executive officials from the state who looked at our state and local tax system in detail. They took testimony from a lot of people, and they identified 5 principles that need to be followed for Ohio's tax system. One of those principles is competitiveness, which my opponent has talked about. And clearly, being competitive with other states and other countries is an important principle that needs to be considered when designing a tax system. But it's not the only one, and it's not the most important one. 2 other principles are just as important, and I would argue they have been violated by our state government. The first one is stability, and the second one is equity. What is stability? It simply means that the tax system generates a sufficiently adequate and stable source of revenue so that the local governments and citizens know that there is enough revenue there to pay the bills. Equity means that it's fair and that wealthier people are able to pay more in taxes. That is, for example, why the estate tax, which my opponent led the effort to eliminate, only affected the top 7% of estates in Ohio. It affected wealthy people. They paid a tax that people who were not as wealthy did not pay. It was an equitable tax from the point of view of equity. When you hit bad economic times, as we did a few years ago, the last thing that you should do is immediately cut taxes for wealthy people and deprive local governments of the stable revenue that they need to provide essential government services. But that's exactly what this General Assembly did. Let me look at history now that we've talked about fiscal policy. We don't need to look any farther than the creation of the local government fund. It was created during the height of the Great Depression. In 1935, the state created this new fund, the local government fund, for the purpose of taking state revenues and giving them to local governments so that they could provide essential government services. At the same time they created the fund, they instituted a new 3% sales tax. So this is the height of the Great Depression, and they're levying a new tax. Why? Because local governments were no longer able to provide essential government services. And the state made the decision that it's best to provide those services at the local level, not at the state level. So they raised taxes and created the local government fund. If we could raise taxes during the middle of the Great Depression, then we could do it now, if we decided that was necessary. It was wrong to assume that there's no choice but to slash funds for local governments and essential government services, and it was harmful. And I'm going to talk about the harmful effects of the cuts to the local government fund more in just a little bit. Thank you.
Well, I'd like to address a couple of the points that were made, and I'll start with the first segment my opponent was mentioning, which is the education system, and that it's unconstitutional. Well, I guess that's a matter of interpretation. The Supreme Court doesn't think so, or they would have already intervened long ago with that. The issue with the DeRolf decisions was, as my opponent mentioned, the over-reliance on property tax. Well, after the decisions were handed down, the state increased their share 61%. So they made up the difference with local property tax so that it was equitable, so that school districts in general received mostly the same amount of money. So if you're in a poorer school district, the state would then augment that and with additional revenue. One of the other issues, too, is over-reliance on property tax. In this district, in the district that we're running for, District 41, if you eliminate the property tax as a source of, or lower it substantially as a source of funding for schools, you're either going to be paying higher taxes in our communities, in Centerville and Kettering and Oakwood and Riverside, or you're going to get less money. You're going to have less money for schools. And you're going to have less money for teachers under that idea. I do believe, though, that the funding formula does need to be reformed, and that's something that we are working on. But that's definitely an issue. One of the other things, too, just to correct my opponent on a couple of issues, she said that there's dire for financial straits for local governments and schools. True, but in terms of for schools, for education, she's right. One-time stimulus money was used, and I think irresponsibly by the previous administration because they just kicked the can down the road. It actually was similar to what Illinois did, because Illinois, when they raised taxes, they didn't tighten their belts at all. They just kept spending. And so what happened with the stimulus money is nobody actually made any reforms, and we were faced with the budget deficit when it came in and had to make those decisions. State funding was raised for education. My opponent mentioned that state funding was cut. It was not. In fact, every single school district in Ohio got more state funding than before with the budget that we passed. In fact, the governor's proposal, the House added $91 million additional dollars that had come in because our economy was starting to improve a little bit in terms of the tax receipts. So we added that money to education. It was the #1 priority for us in the House when we were looking at this budget to put that money back in, and $74 million the subsequent year. So no school district received any less funding. The tangible personal property tax, that was repealed in 2000. I believe it was 2006, might have been 2007, but that was, then there was a reimbursement that was going on, but the reimbursement has not ended, as my opponent stated. It's still going on, but the reimbursement rates were lowered, but the House actually passed a measure so that it would freeze the reimbursement for tangible personal property from 2014 on, so the next budget cycle, so that would not be lowered. We put that into the budget. Regarding the third grade reading guarantee being an unfunded mandate, I agree. I fought hard to get more funding. We actually were able to get $13 million for the third grade reading guarantee in funding, and that was a fight, I got to tell you, and we were trying to get a lot more, and because the third grade reading guarantee is based on the system in Florida that had worked out well, but the system in Florida, if you look at money per student, we needed to get about 40 or 50 million in there, and we can only get 13 million. So that's something that we'll definitely be addressing in the future. Contrary to my opponent, I don't think that the best way to grow the economy or increase funds for the state government is to tax people more, especially when they're already hurting, when they're already seeing their food prices go up, their energy prices go up, their fuel prices going up, health care costs, everything's going up for people, and this is the very last time when incomes are flat or stagnant to raise taxes, and it's just that people are already hurting, and that's not the way to go. And in fact, example after example, I just gave one with Illinois. If you raise taxes, your unemployment rate goes up. More people lose their jobs because there's less money to hire people. out there. So raising taxes in a poor economic environment, even the current national administration, President Obama doesn't believe that, and lowered the payroll tax and said that that's not the thing you do in a tough economy. We'll continue here with the next segment.
Let me address a few things, and then I want to talk about the local government fund. We apparently have some disputes about the facts on whether the system is constitutional. My opponent is the only person I've ever heard say that it is constitutional. It is widely agreed that the school's funding system is not constitutional. And in fact, 3 times the Ohio Supreme Court said, we don't have power to fix it. We are going to order the General Assembly to fix it, but it's up to them to do it. They've never done it. My opponent said state funding to schools was not cut. That certainly is not what has been reported. That's Oakwood, for example, slashed over $700,000 from its budget because it received less funding from the state. Centerville is seeking a new levy because it received less money from the state. Perhaps we're arguing semantics, but certainly there are a lot of school officials who believe that they are receiving less state funding. Now I want to talk about the local government fund. In 2011, local governments knew that there was a big budget deficit, and they thought that they would see some cuts in the fund. But they also thought that the state would share equally in the pain and share equally in the cuts. That didn't happen. What the state did was raid the local government fund and take money that was intended for local governments. And it is a severe cut. 50% of the allocation was cut for fiscal year 2012, and it's cut, 25% for 2012, and 50% for 2013. Let me tell you what those numbers are. In 2008, Montgomery County received $35 million from the local government fund. That's going down to $22 million in 2012 and $16 million in 2013. A 50% cut is big when you're talking about local government services. How do you make up that money? Sometimes by cutting salaries, personnel, police, firefighters. These are government entities that have already cut their budgets. So you can't take 50% away and have them provide the same level of services. All right, let me move on to the estate tax. The other thing that our General Assembly did was eliminate the estate tax. As I mentioned, it only affects the wealthiest 7% of estates. It has a long history in Ohio. It's been in existence a long time. And Ohio is not the only state that taxes estate taxes, or the estates. Briefly, and I have talked to one of my tax partners about this, even some wealthy people support it because they'd rather pay taxes when they're dead than have the taxes be paid when they're alive. Go back to equity. Wealthy people should pay more taxes. That's the basis of an equitable system. Paying it when you're dead is perhaps better than paying it when you're alive. Whether it's a good idea or not can be debated another time. But the point is that this General Assembly was irresponsible to eliminate that tax at a time when they were also cutting funds to local governments that required layoffs of teachers, police, and firefighters. We should not cut taxes for the wealthy at the same time that we cut local government services. In my view, that's unconscionable and immoral. Thank you.
Well, just to clarify on the school funding, overall schools received less funding, about 4% less funding. 2% of that was one-time federal dollars that were spent before that my opponent mentioned. So, and about 2% were money that comes from the state, mainly the tangible personal property and kilowatt hour tax reimbursement. So it was overall 2% less funding for the schools from their overall budget. Was something that was cut, and that the economy was really tough and still remains tough. But in the previous 5 years before that 2% cut, spending increased 31%, for instance, in Kettering. So it's never good to have cuts. We don't like to do that. But in tough situations like we faced, rather than raise taxes when we can least afford to do so, a 2% cut I think was not as bad as it's been portrayed. In terms of Montgomery County and the local government fund, most local governments, especially counties, get their money from sales tax, not the state, not the local government fund. So 50% overall was cut from the state's payment to local governments, but something that's being left out is the casinos. The casinos will be providing revenue to counties into the big cities and potentially to smaller cities and townships. And that actual revenue is estimated potentially to reach up to 10 to 20 million for Montgomery County, so more than sometimes making up for what the counties have lost. One of the things on the estate tax, I absolutely led the effort to repeal the estate tax, or sometimes called the death tax. And because, number one, it's not competitive. The states that have estate taxes are the ones that lag the rest of the country in general, because starting in 2002, and this is a complex topic, every state was on their own for estate tax. Before that, everybody basically had the same estate tax. And once that happened, the states that had the high estate tax, citizens left. They went to Florida to live for 6 months and 1 day so they can avoid paying the estate tax. So it's also a double tax. It's taxing money that's already been taxed once, or probably more times than that, during the person's lifetime. So it's unequitable. And finally, my opponent seems to think that if you have a tax that only hits 7% of the citizens, that's equitable. That's the definition of inequity. Because, and it's, in fact, it's not American. Everybody should pay their fair share, not no share. And the estate tax is 93% of the people don't pay it at all. So just those are some of the issues. And I definitely would like to get into a little bit more detail on some of the ideas, because I think instead of talking about some of these specifics, and I think we really need to focus on the ideas for the future rather than simply how much we're going to tax and who we're going to tax, or who has to pay the tax. I mean, really, the way that we're going to really succeed as a state and be the best state in the country and really set the example for the rest of the country is to have innovation and have the will and courage to change the way things are done. So thanks.